I'm here to talk to you today about telling stories on things. And it's important for us to remember that in the ways in which we tell stories today, everything matters. But it's also important to talk about what it means to tell stories in, because I'm an Appalachian, I grew up telling stories, I grew up around storytellers, and I learned and tell stories the way you learn and you tell stories, which are in things like books, and we tell them in movies, and we tell them in TV shows, and sometimes we tell them in lectures in dark hallways, which I see people tweeting about. But I'm here to talk to you about how we tell stories on things. And this is important because when we tell stories on things, everything matters. And we have these tools, and we never know what these tools are. And sometimes when you tell stories on things, blog posts mean something, or video means something, or pictures mean something, or shouts all around you begin to mean something. And you don't always know what that is. Now, these tools that we're going to talk about as storytellers, other people at TED conferences have talked about. Sean Stewart and Jay McGonigal, who you'll hear from later on today, have given talks about these kinds of stories, so I'm not going to delve into them. And in fact, just a few days ago, there was a TEDx Transmedia where people from around the world came to talk about these kinds of stories. What we're going to talk about are the origins, because if I'm a storyteller and I think that stories are important, then I need to know the tools for how I tell these stories. And to do that, we have to go back to the early days of the digital age. And here's a guy named Vannevar Bush, who you should all know about. He founded a thing called the National Science Foundation, but as it turns out, he really understood what this digital world that we lived in was going to be like. And he wrote, along with this other guy named J.C.R. Licklider, who you should know because he oversaw a project that became this thing that you may have heard about called the internet. And he also wrote papers, and he said, both of these guys said, look, there's going to come a time when we create this pervasive environment all around us, and there's going to be digital things flying everywhere, and it's going to be too much for any of us to handle. And so we need tools. And these tools are going to do three things. They will allow us to publish. Go follow the hashtag on Twitter and see what kinds of things are being published. They will allow us to archive things, and they will allow us to search. And that's how we're going to navigate this digital world, which sounds kind of like the world that we live in. But what's really interesting is they said, look, we need these software agents because we can't deal with all of this information that's happening. And these software agents need to act on our behest and on our behalf, which means they have to go do things for us. For instance, if I record something with my TiVo and George Clooney's in it, I may come home and find out that the facts of life has been recorded for me, even though I didn't want that to happen. And if you're over 30, you understand that, and if you're under 30, Google that. And Googling is actually the thing that's operating for us, because you're going to go and type something in, and it's going to give you an answer. So we have these tool sets that are very interesting. And that means we begin to push tales. Now, I grew up learning to tell stories, but that's actually not the way that we're going to be dealing with stories in the future. In fact, we're going to begin to chase them, and we're going to pull them, and they're going to be all around us so that we're not replacing stories in. Books aren't going away. Movies aren't going away. TV, sadly, not going away. But that we have these transmedia experiences that begin to happen. Now, transmedia is just this fancy academic word that I learned once I became an academic that means a thing that my friend Andrea, who tells these kinds of stories, described with a picture, which essentially means I disassemble a story and place it in lots of different places, some real and some not, and use software agents and tools to allow people to go find those stories. We've seen this develop in a thing called alternate reality games, which Jane McGonigal will talk about later on today in one of the TED videos. But Sean Stewart's actually gone one step further, and he's written a book. Now, for those of you who are under 30, this one you probably will get, and if you're over 30, go Google this. There's a thing called Kathy's Book. And it's a book that's written as a self-contained story. It's a story in a book, and in that book are lots of websites and phone numbers and Google Voice numbers and things that exist in cyber and real space that you have to go experience outside of the book to really, truly understand what's going on. So if we have these tools, and if we have this network, and if we're beginning to talk about these kinds of stories in these different ways, Maybe there's a new kind of story. But this only means something interesting to me if it takes place outside of fiction as well. Otherwise, we just sort of have a new piece of fiction. So this distributed story that I've talked about has actually happened in real life on Twitter. There was a protest in Iran after Ahmadinejad was elected the president, and tens of thousands of people across that country began sending out tweets, publishing, and I used a thing called TweetDeck to search and archive and parse through this data stream that was out there, and I began to see and construct narratives based on what lots of authors were saying. Now, this was real life and very serious to them, but I had hundreds of narratives developing in front of me, and then it spilled over into YouTube, and it became video, and then it spilled over into Flickr and became images. And I used FriendFeed to pull all these narratives together so that I had a multimedia experience. And this repurposed narrative that I was creating would be different than a narrative that any of you created. And this is this pervasive environment of storytelling, of transmedia storytelling, where you hear yawps in the audience and you don't know why. We have a sense that what we are seeing is only part of a whole. It's not surprising that we live in a time where we distrust the actual media less than we ever have before, because we have these tools where we can parse into data streams and see something beyond what somebody has told me, and it calls into question what I do. So now if you believe what I'm saying, and you totally should because I'm really smart, these kinds of stories exist, this story 4.0. My students who are here think that's very funny because they hear that every day. So what this leaves us with is this idea, right, that everything that you see around you matters. And that if we're going to teach this to people, because we have to, because let me just tell you as an aside, things like digital natives, I'm so happy to say this on stage, don't exist. You grow up in an environment where people most likely speak English all around you, but we don't refer to people as English natives. In fact, we make them study literature in English. You grow up in a world surrounded by science, and yet we make you take physics and chemistry. We don't just imagine that somehow you understand how the sun works. It's a magical ball in the sky. So we have to teach these kinds of things, these storytelling techniques to people, and we're at the dawn of this. And we have to understand that we're not only teaching stories in things like books and movies and talks, but we're teaching stories on things. And everywhere around us, these stories can take place. And if that happens, if we believe that these stories take place all around us, and everything matters, and these tools are important, then it's important for us to remember that sometimes the story that you're hearing is a lecture on stage. And sometimes the beginning of the story starts here, and it goes somewhere else, maybe on a PowerPoint, where the real story happens. Thank you very much.